Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories. Being at a party, a husband not finding his wife decided to check all the bedrooms, and in one of them he saw this. Today's story has a similar plot. Enjoy it! Janet Simpson burst into the living room, put her hands on her hips, and shouted, "Damn it, George, are you going to take out the trash or not?" George Simpson slowly lowered the newspaper, looked coldly at his wife, and answered in a calm voice, "I told you I would take out the damn trash as soon as I finished reading the newspaper." Janet returned to the kitchen, muttering, "To hell with it, let it rot," and snorted. George sat there, feeling his blood pressure rise. He didn't know how much longer he could endure this. Their relationship had been going downhill for months. It seemed his wife was doing everything she could to ruin their marriage. He stood up, walked over to the bar, and poured himself some scotch without ice. Returning to his chair, he leaned back and wondered, what the hell is going on? He asked himself again, taking a sip. He mentally returned to the past. Damn, he thought, I once adored her, literally worshipped her. Now I get chills when she walks into a room. His thoughts went back to when he met Janet in college. He was a senior in business, and she was a second-year education major. At first glance, he realized that he had found his life partner. In his eyes, she was the embodiment of femininity. She was short, about 160 centimeters, with a figure that, in his opinion, was ideal. She had light brown hair, brown eyes, and the cutest lips he had ever seen. As he got to know her better, he was fascinated by her personality. She was sweet, kind, and smart. He courted her with passion, and it didn't take long before they became a couple. Their friends knew that if they saw George, they could be sure that Janet would be there too. George smiled slightly, remembering their first date. They spent the whole evening talking. They seemed to feel each other as if they had known each other all their lives. George knew he didn't want to ruin anything. When the evening ended and he dropped her off at her dorm, he simply took her hand to say goodbye. Janet leaned over and kissed his cheek, quietly asking, "Will you call me George?" He blushed and stammered, of course, I'll definitely call." And he did. On the third date, as they were saying goodbye, Janet leaned over and kissed him, asking again, "Will you call me George?" Again, George smiled and replied, "Of course." They both laughed. On the fourth date, as George was driving her home, Janet suggested, "The lake should be beautiful tonight. Let's drive there." A year later, they made love. He knew she wanted to wait, and he respected her wishes. They immediately began living together. As soon as George graduated from college, he took a job in the area as a marketing intern and rented an apartment. The salary wasn't very big, but he saw potential in it. Janet continued her studies and received a degree in education. 2 years later, they got married, and almost a year later, they had twins, a boy and a girl. They were delighted. They had planned to have 2 children, and here they were, as they say, in one fell swoop. Janet wanted to stay home with the children, and George agreed. It also seemed important to him that she'd be a housewife, at least for a while. It was financially tight, but they managed. George was given more responsibility and promoted as he demonstrated his competence. Janet was insistent that they buy a house and convinced George that now that the twins were over a year old, it was time for her to look for a teaching job. With the extra income, buying a home became more than possible. Daycare was available for twins. Marge, her friend from college who was married to a teacher, told her that there were openings in the suburban school system where her husband worked. Armed with her credentials, she interviewed and was hired as a high school teacher for the fall semester. Although George wasn't entirely thrilled with her going to work so soon, he recognized her desire to have a home and didn't put up too much of a fight. The extra income quickly allowed them to get a mortgage, and they began looking for housing in the Janet School District. Marge was again a big help in convincing them to look at properties in her area. It didn't take long before they found a house that Janet loved, which just so happened to be 3 doors down from Marge and Phil Brock's house. The 2 couples became very close friends. Marge and Phil had a boy a year older than the twins and a girl just a few months younger. They often exchanged dinners and spent many summer holidays together. Although George did not consider Phil a close friend or confidant, He recognized that Janet felt very close to both of them, and of course, he went along with it. As the years passed, George rose through the ranks of the company to a management position, enjoying the salary along the way. Janet also remained with the school district, led her department, and was just promoted to assistant principal of the high school. This promotion was facilitated by Phil Brock, who transferred from the high school and was appointed principal of that same school. The children surfaced in George's thoughts, and he realized that they were now 22 years old and already independent. My God, where did the years go? He thought. Now we should enjoy life with less responsibility, enough money, and time to enjoy life with each other. Why did everything suddenly go wrong? Things came to a head at Brock's Christmas party. The place was crowded with neighbors and colleagues from school. The alcohol flowed freely, as usual, and George soon felt that he was no longer in pain. The whole evening seemed vague to him. He remembered dancing with Jan, then with Marge, and it seemed with several other women. He remembered how Marge had kissed him under the mistletoe for a quick kiss. Then everything became even more blurry. He could have sworn he saw Janet with some guy, but that wasn't clear either. He remembered that he was angry with her, but he no longer remembered why. The morning after the party, George and Janet staggered home, took off their outerwear in the living room, and swayed to the bedroom. Who knows what time it was? Later in the morning, Jan shouted to him that she was going to take the clothes to the dry cleaners on Monday and would include the jacket he wore to the party. He mumbled agreement as he slowly walked toward the bathroom. Suddenly the door swung open, and he saw Janet standing with hot eyes, holding a lavender bikini. George stood rooted to the spot, his mouth open. He muttered, "What are you talking about?" he asked, feeling his headache getting stronger. "Son of a... I just knew you were cheating on me, and here's the proof." "You didn't even bother to get rid of the evidence," Janet shouted. George stumbled back and knocked her hand away from his face. "What the hell are you talking about? Are you crazy? What do I know about panties?" Janet lowered her voice and hissed, "They were in your pocket, honey. You forgot to get rid of them. You just stuffed them in your jacket pocket before you cheated on me." George looked at her in complete bewilderment. Who was this woman? He had never seen Janet so angry. Reason took over, and he softly told her, "Janet, I've never seen these things before in my life, and I honestly have no idea how they ended up in my pocket. I can't believe you think I cheated on you. That will never happen. It never was and never will be." Janet's eyes softened for a moment, then became cold again. "You lie, George Simpson, and I will get back at you. You think you can cheat with impunity? Well, you'll find out that you're not the only one who could attract a lover." Still clutching the panties in her fist, Janet turned and left the bathroom, leaving George standing there, looking after her without understanding anything. To say that the following days in the Simpson house were tense would be an understatement. Janet did not speak to him except when absolutely necessary. George tried over and over again to get her to talk, to no avail. She refused to listen to him. She had already decided that he was cheating, and no amount of talk could convince her otherwise. What George couldn't understand was why she was so confident. It couldn't just be those damn panties. He honestly had no idea how they ended up in his pocket. How could she be so sure of his infidelity on such weak grounds? Where was the trust? Why did she suddenly turn into such a jealous witch? George thought about it. Did he miss something? He suddenly realized, perhaps belatedly, that Janet's behavior and attitude had gradually changed since the beginning of the fall when she accepted her new position as assistant principal. The changes were subtle and gradual, so gradual that he didn't notice. He now realized that it had started since the beginning of the school year. Janet seemed a little withdrawn and thoughtful, as if she had something on her mind. Little by little, she became irritable and impatient with him. Little things drove her crazy. By the end of the year, she was almost a different person. At first, he chalked it up to stress from her new position. She now had more responsibility and worries, but it had to be something more. Very gradually, a coolness arose between them. The small gestures of tenderness were gone. What happened to that sweet and patient disposition? He also realized that night with Janet had become a rare occurrence. With some surprise, he admitted that they had not made love for over a month, or was it 2? It was always something like the proverbial headache, I think my period is starting, or I think my throat is starting to hurt, etc. He didn't make the lack of physical intimacy an issue, given the growing gap. He realized with more than a little unease that he really didn't have much desire to make love to her. On New Year's Eve, Janet approached him. She stood in the doorway of the office where he was and said, "George, I've got your suit dry clean. We're going to the Salter New Year's party tonight. Be ready by 8. With these words, she turned and left. George sat and looked after her. These were the first words from her all day. He really didn't think they would go anywhere tonight, much less to a party. He shook his head sadly, but knew he would go. He was too tired to argue. If she wanted to go to a party tonight, then fine. He felt a little strange. He really didn't think she would be in the mood for another party considering what happened at the last one. Well, he thought, at least it's within walking distance. I won't have to worry about driving tonight. At exactly 8 p.m., they walked down the street to the house of Harry and Susan Salter. It was a big building. The Salters had built an addition and done many renovations. They also spent a ton of money building a huge suite of rooms in the basement, including a TV room, billiards room, sauna, and communal games area. Their house definitely had enough space for a party of that size. It seemed like the whole neighborhood was there. People were crowded throughout the house, from the kitchen to the family room, and of course, the basement. Janet walked away from him as soon as they entered the house, and George did not know where she had disappeared to. He had made a conscious decision to strictly limit his drinking. He wanted to be clear-headed tonight. He was soon deep in conversation with several men, sipping from a glass of whiskey. He swore that this would be his only drink for the entire night. Time passed, and he was surprised to hear everyone counting down to the new year. He looked around for Janet, but she was nowhere to be seen. The sight of all the couples kissing on New Year's Eve made him sad. At that moment, he truly felt alone. He just didn't know what else could be done to save their marriage. George had had enough. He just wanted to go home and go to bed. This whole scene here depressed him. He started looking for Janet, but was unsuccessful. She was neither in the basement nor on the first floor. Puzzled, he looked around, not knowing where else she could have gone. Perhaps she went to the bathroom. He went upstairs to find the hallway bathroom occupied. He then went into the master bedroom to check the master bathroom. Entering the room, he stopped and looked in bewilderment. He saw Janet kissing with a guy. "You!" George hissed. His face turned pale, and his fingers clenched into fists. His anger was such that he actually trembled, trying to control himself. Janet turned away from Harry, looked at George, and said coldly, upset, "George? You stupid. Now you know how it feels. Don't like it, huh?" George turned around and left the room. He slowly walked back towards his house, entering through the front door and heading towards their bedroom. He methodically removed all of his toiletries from the master bathroom and placed them in the guest bathroom. He then removed his clothes from the main closet and placed them in the guest bedroom. He vowed that he would never sleep in the same room as her again. The whole operation took him no more than 15 minutes. He undressed and was getting ready for bed when he heard the front door open and Janet enter. She walked upstairs and entered the master bedroom. After a few seconds, she headed to the guest room and burst through the door. "You are a coward," she hissed. "Just ran away like the coward that you are. Didn't like it, huh? It hurts when you find your spouse cheating, doesn't it? I knew you'd come looking for me at midnight. How did you like what you saw? You planned this, didn't you?" George said breathlessly, "You did this on purpose to hurt me, to humiliate me. You're completely crazy. You really need the services of a psychiatrist." He slowly approached her and firmly pushed her into the corridor, whispering, "Get away from me. If you want a divorce, you will get it. I will not contest it. Contact your lawyer. I will accept any terms you offer. I'm tired of you. I've reached my limit." George then closed the door forcefully in her face and locked it. Phil Brock sat in his office, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Everything is turning out exactly as I knew it would," he thought. "I knew it would take time, slowly but surely. It couldn't be obvious at first, just a little clue, then another little clue. Slowly but surely, Phil knew last year that he would get the job he wanted. He applied, interviewed, and was offered the job of high school principal, a position he had coveted since learning that Fran Higgins, the previous principal, was retiring. He had the qualifications and experience. He was almost sure that the job was his. It was a good step up the career ladder, with additional responsibility and a decent salary increase. There was another reason he wanted the position. What no one ever knew was that he had been lusting after Janet Simpson for years. It almost became an obsession. When he got the position he wanted, he began planning to seduce Janet Simpson. He knew he had to be extremely careful. Janet was not a fool. She was a shrewd and very smart woman. His first step was to convince her to apply for the position of assistant principal. She had doubts when he first raised the issue with her, but he convinced her that she definitely had the skills and experience for the job and that he would be happy to have her on his administrative team. She was flattered and applied. It was easy to guarantee her appointment. No one would challenge his decision on this issue. The first step was completed. Now they would work together every day. The second phase would begin when she started working at the beginning of the fall semester, but he had to be very, very careful. At first, only small hints. While sitting and eating a sandwich for lunch with Janet in the faculty cafeteria, he casually remarked, "Yesterday, I had to go to the office building downtown, and I think I saw George going into Syros for lunch with a real hottie. Wow, he really has attractive clients. Lucky guy." Janet looked at him quizzically. "I don't think you've seen George, Phil. He told me last night that they ordered sandwiches because they were too busy to go out for lunch." "Oh, I guess I was wrong. Jan, it was probably just someone who looked like him. My attention was more focused on that pattern on his arm," Phil laughed. The following week, Phil learned that George had been called back to the office that evening due to some urgent issue. He didn't return home until 11 p.m. His wife, Marge, was on the phone that evening with Janet and inadvertently passed this information on to Phil. The next day, again during a quick lunch they were having together, Phil commented almost in passing to Janet, "You know that guy I said George looked like? What a coincidence, but I swear I saw that guy coming out of the main Hilton Hotel. It was pretty dark, so I couldn't see very well, but you can tell George that he has a doppelganger wandering around town." Phil then quickly changed the subject but noted the line of concern on Janet's face. It took months, but he noticed certain changes in Janet. Her carefree, sunny, and open spirits seemed to be fading away. She was often a little moody and brooding. Small wrinkles appeared between her eyebrows. He didn't press. He had to be very careful. In December, he was able to introduce the next phase. It was a couple of weeks or so before Christmas break when Janet walked into Phil Brock's office. "Phil, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course, January. I will always find time for you. Please, have a seat." Janet looked nervous and unsure. She held a handkerchief in her hands, which she nervously twisted. Looking up at Phil, she said quietly, "Phil, I'm pretty sure George is cheating on me. I really don't know what to do. I'm afraid to confront him because I have no real proof. I really need some advice." Careful, careful, he thought to himself. Slowly, slowly, he reminded himself. Pulling Janet into the chair next to him and taking her hand in his, he said quietly, "I know, January. I've suspected it for a while now, but I really didn't know if I should even bring it up with you. What should I do, Phil? I love him. I don't want to lose him, but I can't come to terms with this," she said with tears in her eyes, stroking her hand. Phil looked at her seriously. "Don't do anything now, Janet. You don't have proof, and you really need proof before you do anything. If you confront George now, he'll just deny everything. Let me help you, January. I know someone who can help. Let me work on this for a while. How can I continue to live like this, Phil? It's tearing me apart. George knows what I suspect. Things are really tense between us," Janet whispered. Phil squeezed her hand tightly, looking straight into her eyes. "You need to back off a little, January. Don't provoke a conflict. Try to act as normal. Don't let the situation get out of control at home, okay?" Janet nodded silently. What are you going to do, Phil? What are you up to? Just leave it to me. It might take a while. I think we can get the evidence you need, but you need to act as normal as possible at home. Can you do that? Can you hold on? Janet nodded again. Thank you, Phil. Thank God for your friendship. I'll do as you say, even though it'll be damn hard. Phil warned her, don't say a word to anyone, January. Not even Marge. I trust her, of course, but this is a very delicate situation. This should remain just between us. Rest assured, everything will be resolved one way or another. With these words, Phil walked Janet to the door of his office. Closing the door behind her, he leaned against the wall and laughed quietly. Oh yes, he thought. Oh yes, I'll be sleeping with her long before she knows. Quickly going to his desk, he picked up the phone and dialed a number. Teddy, this is Phil Brock. I have another little photo retouching job to do. Hey, Phil. Teddy Dogadoo laughed. Teddy was one of the best photographic technicians in the East. He could take photographs, digitally process them, and show you a realistic image of Abraham Lincoln having dinner with Harry Truman, and you would believe it because it looked real. Another hot case, Phil? Teddy continued. The last time I did this for you was, 3 years ago? You never told me how it went. Everything went well, Teddy. You know you do a great job, and you charge good money for it, Phil muttered. Teddy laughed. If you want better, you've got to pay. Phil, you pay pennies, you get monkeys. You know that. Okay, what's on your mind? Same crap, Teddy. I'll give you pictures of the guy, as many as I can and as varied as possible. I need pictures of some woman without anything, too. Put them together like last time, okay? Phil, no problem. Just this time, I won't be able to take it on right away. I'm swamped with a huge project. I won't be able to start your work until early next year. Can you wait that long? Phil thought for a moment. Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. In the meantime, I'll send you some basic photos as soon as I can. They ended the call, and Phil sat back, thinking about his next steps. First, he needed pictures of George Simpson, preferably without anything or semi. This shouldn't have been a problem. He knew that George went to the fitness center at the club every other day, where he worked out and then took a shower. He would be there as if by chance, so Phil should have been able to take some pictures. Thank God for his cell phone camera. Now, about the woman without clothes. The last time he used a woman of easy virtue, but since the police chief began actively cleaning up the area, she was no longer a likely option. However, he needed pictures of a without clothes, quite decent-looking woman. This could be a problem. Phil's eyes suddenly widened as an idea popped into his head, and he burst out laughing. Great, he thought, just wonderful. Marge will help me get Janet into bed, and she won't even know it. Phil Brock left school early that day. He knew Marge would be home later. Entering his bedroom, he placed the camera on a book in the closet opposite the bed. He used a wide-angle lens and made sure a new card was loaded into the camera. He then set the timer to take a frame every 30 seconds. It would start the timer when appropriate. He stepped back and laughed. Damn, I'm so, brilliant. Phil made himself a drink, sat down on a chair, and turned on the news on TV. A little later, his wife entered the house. Marge, glad you're back. Don't worry about dinner, I'll treat you. You deserve good food cooked by someone else, Phil said with a smile. Marge stopped and looked at him in surprise. You're kidding, right? What's the reason? No special occasion, darling. I just want to show my gratitude for everything you do for me, Phil flattered, smiling. After dinner, Phil helped her up the stairs to her bedroom. That evening, he was able to get the photos he needed. The next day, New Year's Day, Janet was sitting alone in the kitchen. George had left early. No one knew where she heard him leave the house early in the morning, but she did not leave the room until she was sure he had left. She really couldn't face him. Her emotions were agitated. A mixture of anger, pain, jealousy, fear, and shame flooded her thoughts. Perhaps George is right, she thought. I could really use a good psychiatrist or at least a good divorce lawyer. It seemed pretty obvious that their marriage was over, and as far as she could tell, she just couldn't think of a reason for it. Why did George do this? She cried again and poured herself a cup of coffee. The next morning, Janet was called into Phil Brock's office. When she walked in, Phil noticed what everyone had been talking about, Janet Simpson's appearance. She was emaciated and pale. It was obvious that she had lost weight, and her clothes seemed a little too big for her. "It's time to end the game, Janet," Phil said. "Good to see you. Please, have a seat. We have a little problem regarding our trip to the university. The graduates we wanted to interview for open positions will not be available at the time we planned. We will have to go on Friday and try to get as much done as possible on Friday and Saturday. We can come back on Sunday, so we won't miss too many school days. If you go on Friday morning, you can have everything ready by the time I get there early in the day. You shouldn't have any problems." Janet nodded silently. Phil looked at her nervously. "Janet, you have to hold on. Look, I promise when this trip is over, everything will be over. I think all our suspicions will be confirmed." Janet's eyes widened. "What do you mean, Phil?" Phil smiled at her reassuringly. "My investigator called yesterday and said he'll have everything by Friday morning. I'll bring everything with me when I go. And no, Jan, I don't know what he has yet. We'll find out soon enough." Janet sighed and stood up. "I hope it makes me feel better. I can't go on like this anymore. I'll really be glad when this is all over. Thanks again, Phil. I really appreciate all your support." Phil touched her arm as she walked toward the door. "Don't thank me yet, January. We're not done yet, but I promise everything will be fine." Early that Friday morning, Janet Simpson was driving along the highway toward the university. She drove the car, sticking to the speed limit almost mechanically. She was calm and collected, resigned to the information she was about to receive and the end of her marriage. She had endured months of anxiety and emotional turmoil, leaving her with nothing but emptiness, a vacuum where love and trust used to be. Even the anger and bitterness had disappeared. She arrived at her hotel, checked in, and then headed to campus. She went through the motions of setting up some interviews they were supposed to have later in the day. She tried to occupy her mind, not thinking about what Phil had, but knowing that the result would be what it should be. Later that day, Phil arrived and, upon seeing Janet, stormily informed her that they would not talk about George and that he would speak to her after dinner. Janet saw that he was clearly very upset and was puzzled. He seemed to have heard news that upset him much more than George's supposed infidelity. She sighed, knowing she would have to wait. Dinner that evening at the hotel with Phil passed almost silently. Phil seemed thoughtful and drank more wine than usual. He insisted that she join him by pouring her a glass, but she only took a sip from her glass, not wanting to get drunk. She felt that she would need all her mental faculties that evening. "Phil, that's enough," Janet insisted. "There's clearly something you want to tell me, something that upsets you. We need to talk, and we need to do it now." Phil took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, you're right, January. It's probably time. Come up to my room, and I'll show you what I have." He stood up and, lowering his shoulders, led her out of the dining room. Entering his room, Phil sat her down on a chair and began to walk back and forth. "Jan," he turned to her, "I'm obviously very upset, but not just because of your torment. It looks like I'm in the same situation." With these words, he dumped a dozen photographs onto her lap. She picked them up and sobbed, tears appearing in her eyes. In front of her were pictures of George and Marge. She quickly looked away. The scenes before her were like acid to her soul. In an instant, she had the proof she needed but desperately didn't want. But Marge. She began to cry. "One of my best friends. Why Marge?" She sobbed, looking at Phil. She saw him standing there with his head down, a look of complete defeat on his face. She suddenly understood how he felt, and her heart responded to him. She quickly stood up and hugged him, holding him in her arms. "Oh my God, Phil, it must be devastating for you to find out so suddenly and without warning," she said. She knew how he must feel, and her heart ached for him. Everything was coming together now. All the months of planning were about to work out. He kissed her. "Oh, Janet, I really need you," Phil whispered to her. The sudden affectionate treatment caused Janet to start and wake up from her daze. Janet was what George called her when they made love. She realized what was happening, what she was on the verge of doing, and placed her palms on Phil's chest. She gently pushed him away. Phil felt her tension and froze, instinctively understanding that the mood was spoiled and the temptation would not take place. Fury took hold of him, and he trembled with hot anger. All these months wasted, all for nothing. "No," he screamed to himself. "I'll kill her first." He fought to regain control, suppressing his irritation. If not Plan A, then he would have to use Plan B, he thought desperately. "I'm really sorry, Phil. I just can't." "I hope you understand," Janet said. Phil's tough exterior weakened as he accepted his new role. "I understand, Janet. I'm really sorry that I lost control. I assure you it won't happen again. Forgive me," he begged. Janet stroked his cheek affectionately. "Of course, Phil. This is a shock for both of us. We both need to think about what to do. I suspect that my marriage is really over," she said with a quiver in her voice. Phil Brock turned and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the minibar in his room. Turning to Janet, he said, "Well, at least we can have a drink and maybe toast to our new position. You can at least have a drink with me, Jan, can't you?" "Sure, Phil, but just one." "Then I better get going. It's getting late, and I have some decisions to make." She sat back down and watched as Phil made himself comfortable on the bed. They drank the smooth whiskey slowly and wondered what Monday would bring. It didn't take long before the glass slipped from Janet's fingers and fell to the floor. Phil watched as she drifted off to sleep with satisfaction. The pill always worked. She was unconscious for several hours. He knelt in front of her and laughed quietly. "One way or another, honey, we will have an intim, and this will not be a one-time occurrence." Then he too felt dizzy and slowly collapsed next to Janet on the bed. His eyes rolled back into his head as he lost consciousness. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the curtains when Janet opened her eyes. Her head hurt, and she felt nauseous. The strong need to urinate forced her to get out of bed and go to the bathroom. Sitting on the toilet, she realized she was without clothes. She dried herself off, stood up, and looked back into the room to see Phil Brock sprawled without clothes on the bed. She then turned around and vomited into the toilet. Her thoughts were incoherent, and she couldn't remember what happened. "Did I really sleep with Phil Brock?" she asked herself in bewilderment. She quickly washed herself and, picking up her clothes from the floor, got dressed. As she was about to leave, she saw an envelope with photographs on the table. Picking it up, she left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. Rushing to her own room, she quickly undressed and climbed into the shower. She rubbed herself vigorously, trying to wash away the imagined stench of her betrayal. Her thoughts were confused. It was difficult for her to think clearly or remember the events of the past night. She just couldn't believe she had actually slept with Phil. First of all, she didn't feel as if she had had a night. She always felt the effects of the physical act the next morning. This time, there was no such feeling, but the fact that they had both slept without anything meant it obviously belonged to Phil. She shook her head in confusion. Secondly, she remembered that they were kissing, but she came to her senses and stopped it. She had apologized to Phil and said she couldn't continue. What happened after that? She tried to remember. She recalled they stopped kissing and drank, but everything that happened afterward was a blank. What happened after the drink? They both got drunk. Was I that drunk? Damn, I just don't remember. Another thought occurred to her, and she turned pale. Asterisk, oh my God, how am I going to look George in the eyes? I did the same thing I accused him of. But he's been cheating on me for who knows how long, and now I have terrible evidence. Asterisk, she realized that there were now photographs of her. Asterisk, I really don't think we actually had a night. At least I'm pretty sure of it. Asterisk, she made a sound as she remembered the photos. Asterisk, Marge? I can't believe it was Marge, one of my close friends. Why did she do that? Asterisk. Asterisk, oh, Phil, poor Phil. George and his wife. Oh my God, what I did to Phil last night. I just can't meet him today. I just can't, asterisk. Her mind, full of confusion and bewilderment, Janet quickly dried herself off, got dressed, packed her things, and ran out of the hotel. When she got to her car, she threw her bag in the back seat, then jumped behind the wheel and drove home. Driving along the highway, she again tried to make sense of what was happening to her. Asterisk, perhaps George is right. Perhaps I really need a psychiatrist, asterisk, she thought. Asterisk, but he cheated. I knew it then, and now I have horrifying proof. He cheated on me with one of my best friends. How is this possible, asterisk? Oh my God, what is happening to me, she sobbed as she drove. One thing I know for sure, Janet said out loud to herself, asterisk, when I get home, George and I will sit down and talk it out. I'm absolutely not going to sit back and let this continue. I don't know how long this will last, but I'll tell George we're done. He wouldn't do that if he really loved me. Our marriage is obviously over, asterisk. As she spoke these words, tears flowed down her cheeks. George Simpson sat with a newspaper on his lap. He found that he could not concentrate on the words. He acknowledged the dilemma he faced and accepted the likely outcome. It was obvious that his marriage was over, but he still hated the conclusion. He knew he loved Janet, not the Janet of the last few months, but the Janet he had married and grown old with. What happened to that woman? Suddenly, the door burst open, and his wife entered the room with a renewed and almost mad expression on her face. George, she shouted. We have to figure this out right now. Immediately. It's time for confessions and decisions. With these words, she sat down in front of him and stared at him intently. George looked at her calmly, sighing. He repositioned himself in his chair and replied, Good idea, January. I think it's a really good idea. What would you like to confess? Janet looked at him with her mouth open. Me? I have to confess. You're crazy. It's you who needs to confess. You? Her voice rose. Okay, Jan, what do I have to confess? George's voice was quiet and restrained. He didn't want it to turn into a scream. It looked like this little conversation would be the resolution he knew would come. At least she would be relatively calm. Janet pulled herself together. She wouldn't lose control. She pulled the envelope containing the photographs from her purse and tossed it into George's lap. Guess what, George? You don't have to admit anything. The evidence of your betrayal is now in your lap, no pun intended, she said, her voice tense with emotion. George wearily opened the envelope and took out the photographs. His jaw literally dropped when he saw what they depicted. An expression of complete amazement appeared on his face. He tried to speak, but found that he could not formulate the words he was looking for. Janet was a little taken aback. She looked at George, surprised and more than a little bewildered by his expression. She saw no guilt, shame, or embarrassment, only complete surprise and amazement. She didn't know what to think. He had to look guilty and repentant, rather than stunned. George finally closed his mouth, walked over to Janet, and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. Janet, I really want you to listen to me carefully, he said. I want you to look at me while I'm talking. Can you do this for me? This is very important. Can you do this? Janet, now completely puzzled, nodded. This wasn't going the way she had expected. George continued, Jan, these pictures are fake. I'll tell you how I know. What they show never happened. Look at me, Jan, it never happened. He emphasized his words, his voice shaking with emotion, hoping she would believe him. I swear on everything that is dear to me that what is shown in these photographs never happened. I don't know how these photographs were created, but I think it's time we sit down together and get to the root of what is happening with us. Janet looked at him carefully. Suddenly, there was no doubt in her mind that George was telling her the truth. She knew him too well, and the passion and pain in his voice finally convinced her that he was honest. George, she whispered, am I crazy? I don't even recognize myself. I was sure you were cheating on me. There wasn't the slightest doubt. What's happening to me? It's like I've become a different person. Janet collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. George put his arm around her and held her tenderly. It was a good thing she couldn't see his face at that moment. His lips were pursed, and his eyes narrowed. Now he fully understood what had happened to his wife. He let go of her, sat down next to her on the sofa, and took her hands. Listen to me, January. Let's go back in time. When did these doubts about me first arise? Let's remember this summer. We didn't have any problems then, right? Yes, George, we didn't have any problems, Janet recalled. Then let's move forward a little to when you started your new job. Think about the first weeks of the school year. Think about when you first started having doubts about me. Let your mind go back and let it come back, he purred softly. Janet closed her eyes, remembering. Slowly, she began going through the events. She talked about the little inconsistencies that caught her eye, the times George said he was in one place but was seen elsewhere, the little lies she caught him telling. Phil had kept her informed about what George was doing. He always seemed to know when George was lying to her or when he was somewhere else when he said he was at work. Then everything came to a head last night. Last night, Phil showed her the photos. Oh my God, George, she said tearfully. How can I tell you what happened last night? It's okay, January. Please trust me, everything is really okay now, George reassured her. I believe everything will be fine now. Just tell me everything that happened last night. Janet recounted the events of the previous night, holding nothing back, the photos, the kiss, her stepping away, the last drink, and then waking up in the morning in Phil's bed. George, I woke up without anything, but I swear I don't think he had an intimate with me. Do you know how I feel down to the next morning when we do this? I didn't feel it, not at all. Do you believe me, please? Janet begged. She suddenly turned pale, feeling her stomach flutter. George quickly took her to the toilet and held her while she tried to throw up. After a few moments of dry heaving, he led her into the bedroom and sat her on the edge of the bed. Honey, you've been through a lot. Let me get you some sleeping pills. You really need to get some sleep. Everything will be fine, really, everything will be fine, he said, bringing her water and pills and helping her undress and lie under the blanket. It only took a few moments for her to fall into a deep sleep. Later that day, George quietly opened the bedroom door to check on Janet. Come in, George, she said calmly. I woke up and thought. George came in and sat on the edge of the bed. How are you feeling, dear? He asked, concern in his voice. I feel like a fool, George. I can't understand why I let that scoundrel do this to me. He was so cunning, so careful that I didn't even notice what he was doing. I feel so foolish, so stupid. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I don't know how you can forgive me. I can't even forgive myself. Janet's eyes filled with tears. George took her hand and tried to calm her down. Calm down, January. It's all over now. Our time in hell is over. We'll be fine. George, I know we'll be okay, but this isn't the end. I want this idiot to suffer because he made us suffer. He's evil incarnate, and I'm sure I'm not his first victim. He needs to be stopped and punished. He will be punished. I called Alan Marsden. He will come this evening, George said. Janet turned pale. Chief of police? Why him? George, wait, don't answer. It was a stupid question. Alan is a good friend. He knows what to do. That evening, Alan Marsden settled into a chair in the Simpsons' living room, listening to their story. After they finished, George handed him the photographs. If I didn't believe your story before, these photos definitely confirm what you told me, the chief commented. You understand, Jan, Brock is not done with you yet. From your description of his pursuit, it seems that he will now follow you on a different path. It appears that he is obsessed with you, and you need to be prepared to deal with his downfall. We're likely dealing with an intimate addict who needs to be stopped. Janet nodded. I understand that this is not the end, Alan. I will do whatever you recommend. I agree, he needs to be stopped. Okay, Alan continued. I have an idea that I want to explore. Janet, I'm pretty sure Brock will call you into his office on Monday morning. It's important that he doesn't know that you've talked to me about all of this. I'm also pretty sure that his pursuit will now take a different turn, and I think I know what it will be. Jan, remember you didn't talk to me, and if he asks about George, tell him he's on a business trip and won't be back for a couple of days. I want him to think that everything remains the same in your tense relationship with your husband. He shouldn't know that George is aware of what's happening. Can you do this? Janet nodded again but was puzzled. George interrupted. What are you up to, Alan? Can you share your plans with us? Sorry, guys, Alan replied. It's really best that you two just relax and let me do what I need to do. I promise I know what I'm doing. But now I think it's time for me to go. I'll take these photos with me. I want our lab to study them. They are fast, and we'll find out how they were forged. Alan kissed Janet on the cheek, shook George's hand, and walked out the front door, leaving the couple to stare after him with worry written all over their faces. Later that evening, before going to bed, Janet turned to George and quietly asked, George, will you sleep with me tonight? Just hug me, nothing more. Of course, George replied, and they both smiled. Early Monday morning, as Alan Marsden had predicted, Janet was called into Phil Brock's office. Sitting down without any instructions, she simply looked at him. Phil seemed a little taken aback by her obvious antagonism. You left a little abruptly, Phil began. You were supposed to help me with interviews scheduled for Saturday. This kind of shirking of responsibility will not reflect well on your performance evaluation. Janet continued to stare at him and then snapped, Stop talking nonsense, Phil. I am fully aware of your plan, and it is time to tell you that it is all over. You can forget about it. It's your fantasy that will never happen. Phil Brock grinned evilly at her. Don't be too sure, darling. I've got a bunch of new photos that I'm sure you won't want to show your husband or the school board, for that matter. They won't look too nice, an administrator who uses a school trip for intimate fun and games. I don't think George would be too happy either. Or will you show him the photos taken from my room? Will everyone know about your hobbies, you an idiot? Janet hissed, Did you take pictures of me, you idiot? These photos will show that I was unconscious and not to blame for what some idiot did to me. No, that's not true, Janet. They show what you need, he grinned. Photos always work if seduction doesn't. I'm not your first, am I? Janet's eyes sparkled. You've done this before? I should have known. Phil spat in her direction. Our schools are full of very beautiful women. I've been having fun the last few years. I must admit that you were the most interesting, but I had to play with you for quite a long time. The reward better be worth it, he chuckled. Janet gasped, suddenly remembering Sue Trani. She guessed that Sue and her family had left suddenly last year without saying goodbye or explaining the situation. She had taught at the high school when Janet was there. She left because of you, didn't she? Janet sat in horror. Yes, Phil waved his hand dismissively. She ran away from me, said she couldn't continue sleeping with me. Her marriage was more important than her job. In this case, seduction worked better than photographs, he laughed. Listen, Janet, his eyes became harder and his voice deeper. Now it's time to talk about you. You know that the photos I have of you will ruin your life if they get out. Your career will end, and so will your marriage. You'll be the laughingstock of a whole neighborhood. They may even appear on the internet. Would you like that? You rotten man, you're going to blackmail me, Janet said with disgust in her voice. You'll never get away with this. Of course I will, Phil chuckled. It's a little blackmail between friends. This is how it will be. Otherwise, I will ruin you. You will do everything I tell you to do. This is your future, at least for now. Suddenly, the door opened, and Alan Marsden walked in, followed by two uniformed policemen. Hi, Phil, how are you? I have a search warrant and a warrant for your arrest. Do me a favor, Phil, try to resist. Turning to the police, Alan told them to handcuff Phil and read him his rights. Phil Brock's face showed shock. He was unable to utter a word as he was taken out. Alan turned to Janet. Janet, it looks like you're in charge here, at least temporarily. It's time for you to get busy. You're going to have a busy day. Later that evening, Alan Marsden was again sitting in the Simpsons' living room. He held whiskey and water, just like George. Janet sipped a glass of white wine. Okay, Alan, let's hear all the details about how you arranged this, George said. It wasn't really that hard, Alan said. As I listened to you two and heard everything, it became obvious that Brock was going to confront Janet on Monday. Remember, you told me that seducing him didn't work. Janet, you didn't fall into his arms, you were unconscious, and when you woke up, you were without clothes. It was obvious to me that he had photographed you, and it was more than likely he would use those photographs to blackmail you. After I left you on Saturday, I called Judge Tanny, Alan continued. You know Keith Tanny? It was more of a statement than a question. What you may not know is that Keith Tanny had a serious run-in with Phil Brock several years ago when Brock was an assistant principal at the high school. It seems that Keith's son Ricky called Brock a turd, and Brock did everything he could to get the kid expelled. Mind you, he was clearly overreacting. In any case, it was just a storm in a teacup. The child was suspended for a couple of days, and that was it. Since then, he considers Brock a bad example of a teacher. Alan suddenly grinned like a cat who had caught a mouse. In short, Keith authorized the use of a listening device in Brock's office, as well as a search warrant. We found another set of those photographs you gave me, George. And by the way, our laboratory quickly determined that they had been doctored. Alan approached Janet. Janet, we'll keep everything on tape. I don't think he'll be bothering you or anyone else anytime soon. The school board has already met in an emergency session and suspended Brock, awaiting the outcome of the trial. Tomorrow, you'll find that you've been appointed as the temporary director. Alan, Janet interrupted, those photos Brock took, I hope you don't need them as evidence. I'd be terribly embarrassed. Alan smiled briefly. It looks like these photos were accidentally damaged. No one knows how this happened, but that's okay. There are witnesses to their contents if necessary. Don't worry, Janet, these photos are destroyed forever. Alan stood up and placed his empty glass on the coffee table. That's it, guys. I really don't think you need to worry about Phil Brock. I suspect that creep will regret getting involved with you too. Now, I have to go home. George and Janet stood up and hugged Alan. Alan, we don't know how to thank you, George said, his voice choked. I really need to thank you. I just love catching idiots like Brock, Alan said. Take care of each other. You are good people. With these words, he left. George and Janet looked at each other. Jan, it's late. Let's go to bed, George said quietly. Janet turned to him and kissed him tenderly. Of course, George. Of course, and they both smiled. What do you think of our short story today? In my opinion, the story was sad on the man's part as he exposed his wife's infidelity. What's your opinion? Write in the comments. See you in the next video.